So, have you guys watched the first episode of Lovecraft Country? I hope so, because we're on the second episode. And if you haven't watched the first episode, you done fucked up. You done messed it all up. And I don't think you're ever going to recover from this mistake. But I'm here to help you. I'm here to guide you through this process. My name is Dre Breezy, and this is the episode 2 recap of Lovecraft Country. So we stopped last time at the end of last episode, and there's George, Letty, and Tick, and they get to the mansion, this like mysterious mansion. After fighting off, these crazy vampires, they get to this mansion. They're covered in blood, and before Tick can even knock on the door opens, and there's this Swedish, blonde-haired, blue-eyed looking guy, and he's like, "Welcome home, Atticus." So weird off the jump. That was the end of the last episode. This episode begins with the group. They're in the mansion, and it actually starts off in a really cute way. It starts off to the Jefferson's theme song, "Moving On Up." But it's like a remake. I don't know who did it, but somebody remade it. And they're dancing around and just really enjoying all this wealth. And there's just everything that they could all want. This is what makes it weird and kind of magical. So in Letty's room, she has like all the clothes and fashion that she could ever want. In George's room, he has every book, all of his favorite books, like just on a bookshelf, all the books he could ever want to read. Tick, I don't remember what Tick had, but it was something that he likes. So they have the dance scene with "Moving On Up." They actually come out and they're greeted by the Swedish looking dude. And the Swedish dude is like, "Oh yeah, your father's in." Well, Tick's like, "Where's my dad?" And the Swedish dude is like, "Oh yeah, he's actually on a trip to Boston with the matriarch of the family." He's being real vague and real evasive and just overall giving like sinister kind of vibes. But he's still the help, so he doesn't know too much, which is basically what he's trying to say too. He's like, "Man, I'm kind of like the errand boy. Like I'm the cabana boy, so I don't really know what's going on." But they're talking. They continue a tour of the lodge, and they learn. So this episode, they really kind of set up, I guess, Tick's backstory. Find out that the lodge used to be owned, or was originally created by an ancestor of the family, the Braithwaite family. That's their name, and his name was Titus Braithwaite. Essentially, Titus Braithwaite made his money off of what they call shipping. I'm doing air quotes right now. They called it shipping, which Letty, she always has the best lines in every episode. And she just whispers to George, "That's code for slaves." Because come on now, what the hell were y'all shipping around back then other than people? So, he makes a bunch of money, but our blonde haired dude is like, the original lodge burned down in a fire, and Titus actually died. So, it is what it is. We find out that the tour guide's name is William. He is a close personal friend of Christina Braithwaite, and that's the woman who actually owns the silver car in the driveway. We also find out that the patriarch of the family, the dad, is having a gathering of the other lodge members that evening, and that all of the males are invited to dinner. It's giving me real weird, like Get Out vibes, like cult vibes, but we're going to keep going. So the trio, they're left alone and they decide to have breakfast outside. Letty is like, I don't know, her tone just completely changes and she just turns into just a very cavalier. She just starts really absorbing all the like the wealth and the hoity-toityness of the situation. And so Tick eventually is like, "Letty, like you were acting way too like nonchalant and cavalier, especially given the events of last night. Like the night before, we just had all these monsters attack us, and now we're in this crazy house, and it's clear that they don't want to let us out, and they won't tell us what's happening to my father." And that's when all of a sudden Letty's like, "You know what? I don't even remember what happened last night." And Tick looks at George and he's like, I don't remember either. Something has happened to George and Letty where they cannot remember the night before, yet Tick can. So he starts freaking out. And of course, he tries to explain it to them like, we were in the woods and big giant monsters attacked us and they started eating people and it was, blood everywhere. And you ran into a cabin with your car, which, if somebody told you this and you didn't remember that, you would probably think like maybe you're on drugs, like maybe you didn't take your medication today, Tick. But we the audience know he's telling the truth. What's really clever about the writing in this episode is that like these are black people in the 1950s, and ultimately in their environment they got to stick together. So while they were like, Tick, like, yeah, you might be a little, I don't know what happened in the war, but let's take a step back. They still there still was a large amount of them that clearly wanted to trust what Tick was saying, because at this point in time, white people just can't be trusted. In the 1950s, like, these white people cannot be trusted. Tick is like, okay, well, I know how I can prove that I'm telling the truth. Let's go find the car, because the car got totaled. They go to some shed and they find the car, and of course, whatever magic fucking voodoo shit that the Braithwaite family used to put on George and Letty, they fixed the car too. So then he runs into Samuel, or not Samuel. He runs into William, who is like, "Oh, what are you talking about? The damages to the car. This car is exactly how I found it." Of playing this game, like trying to make it look like or like Tick is losing his mind. So then they storm off. Whatever. They like, dude, you keep playing games. We gonna figure this shit out. Like, we know how this shit works around here. Like, we can't trust y'all, so we're gonna figure it out. So they go to the, like, I guess the village, the downtown village. They're just trying to, do the little detective work, and then they hear the whistle of the same whistle that summoned the vampire monsters away the night before. George, or Tick, recognizes it, immediately. So he goes to find it. It's this sheriff woman with two barking dogs who's blowing the whistle, and this lady is giving straight up like Texas Chainsaw Massacre vibes, for real, some real inbred vibes. She's being all racist and stuff, but he's making the connection like something's going on. As they walk back, she actually makes a comment about they should get back to the mansion before the sun goes down, if they know what's good for them. So they start walking back, the sun is setting, and then George slows down and remembers a story that Tick's mother told him about her great ancestor, who was a slave named Hannah, who escaped her master's house after a fire while pregnant. Obviously, they're kind of putting it in our face. The fire that Tick's ancestor escaped from while pregnant was the same fire that Titus Braithwaite had in that lodge in 1833. So we see that they make that connection. So, and they're in the woods. All of a sudden, the big giant monsters that attacked them the night before just hop out of the ground, surround these guys. They hear the whistle, and then we finally actually meet Christina, who's the girl that saved them in the episode before we meet her for the first time. She has some type of control over these monsters. I mean, they're like pets to her. So she's on a horse. The vampire monsters are like around, following her commands, but they're clearly under her control. She takes Tick. They actually go to meet her father, who is the patriarch of the Braithwaite family, who is also the one who's hosting the dinner later that night. This scene, I don't even know how to describe it because it's fucking weird as hell. It's Samuel, who is played by, his name is Samuel. Her father's name is Samuel. He's played by Tony Goldwyn, who fucking never ages. Like, he looks the exact same as he did when he was the bad guy in Ghost and like in Scandal. Like, that dude just never ages. So he's performing surgery on some random dude with no sedation. So the dude's screaming. It looks like he's taking out the guy's like liver or something. I don't know what's going on, but some weird culty shit. There's candles everywhere. And he starts explaining to Tick how he's he starts telling this story of Genesis, this like allegory of Genesis, and he explains how he's Adam in the situation and how, he's just like the puppet master and how Tick better not get in his way or whatever. It was a weird scene, but the we get the vibe that this is definitely some type of magical cult. Um some type of cult or some kind of weird Jim Jones, something weird. Something weird. That scene ends. When Tick and Christina are walking down, we also have this really interesting dynamic where Tick is like, "Can you? I mean, I'm still looking for my dad. Like, can you? Can some? I know y'all are fucking playing games, but can you help me?" And we can see that Christina is more sympathetic. What starts to happen is we realize that Christina, being a woman, in the 1950s, and this cult is an all boys club, only men are invited. We realize that she feels some resentment, and she also sees some solidarity with the way that Tick and Georgia Letter being treated, really because they're black. And so we're seeing that he's working this angle with her, in terms of using her possibly as an escape plan. So he's talking to her, and she's like, I want to help, but I can't. And he's like, well, can you at least help Letty and George, like, not fuck with their minds, like give them their memories back? She says yes, like snaps her finger, does like the Sabrina the Teenage Witch thing. In the background, we hear George and Letty immediately start screaming because their memories of a traumatic event just pop back in their heads. And George tries to exit the room, and he's blocked by an invisible force field. That's when we kind of realize that, like, this is definitely magic. They show the hieroglyphics on the wall that light up whenever he tries to hit the force field. So there's definitely a strong element of magic. Then this little boy runs in and says, Christina, it's time. And she's like, oh my gosh. And then she runs out to a barn on the estate, and there's a cow that's giving birth. And she like shoves her arm all up that cow's vagina and pulls out what I thought was going to be a baby calf, but it turns out to be a baby vampire monster. The little boy's like, is this your first time doing it? And she says yes. So I'm assuming that they have some kind of genetic program that they're creating these monsters, and they raise them from birth as their own pets. Shit is kind of weird. We go back to the trio, our group in the house. They're all trapped in their rooms with these force fields, but the Braithwaites begin to use some type of illusionary magic to mess with their minds. Letty begins a hot, steamy hookup with an imaginary Tick, which ends really crazy when he starts to pull down his pants, and in lieu of a penis, there is a poisonous viper that tries to bite her. George ends up having like this kind of like romantic dance with a former lover. His wasn't scary. It just was, I think they were trying to tempt him. The seductress woman was going to come, and, he's a married man. So she was just going to take all that, that monogamy away. The Who did I just say? I said George. Yeah. So the last person, Tick, actually had a scene with. So Jamie Chung, I guess, is going to be a reoccurring character. So she was the alien chick that he embraced in the last episode, but this episode she comes in the form of like of they're not Viet Cong if they're in Korea, but you get what I'm saying, Korea Kong, like warrior chick, and they get into this like Kill Bill fight scene, and he ends up choking her to death. But we're now connecting that she is the character that he called in Korea in the episode before, and there's some unfinished business between these two, and she's haunting him, in his dreams and even in his nightmares. That happens, but they're interrupted because a bell rings, the group illusions are broken, and the trio are allowed to leave their rooms, and that's because the ceremony is beginning. So the ceremony, like I said, is all guys, it's a bunch of dudes. It's a black tie event. Tick and George are invited because they're men, but it's kind of an all white, not kind of all white club. This is an all 100% white club because Tick and George are the only black guys there, and it's very obvious that all the other men in the room are very uncomfortable with the fact that these men are there. Also, I forgot to mention earlier, during George's little romantic dance scene, he wanders off and finds a secret library. He finds a book on a table that says the Ancient Order of the New Dawn, I think, the bylaws of the Ancient Order of the New Dawn, and he begins to read the book. So fast forward back to the dinner. George just immediately pulls a power play as soon as they walk into the room. Because he had read the book, he apparently this book was essentially the laws of the cult that the Braithwaites were in. And he did his research and realized that Tick was a direct descendant of Titus Braithwaite, and so he had an automatic membership to this club. And not only did he have an automatic membership to this club, he had a higher status than the rest of these guys, and he could tell them what to do. So as soon as they walk in that bitch, George just tells them all to get the fuck out because they only want to talk to Samuel Braithwaite. So they kick all the guys out. Them guys look shook and dumb and foolish, but they got out. And then the conversation between Samuel and Tick begins. Samuel is actually a really interesting character because he breaks it down to him. He's like, I'm not, what is the word he used, a fanatic like the rest of these guys. And he was like, I'm only following the rules because they follow the rules. So he was like, I'm gonna do what I want. And right now what he's trying to do is create immortality, and he needs Tick because Tick carries magical blood from Titus, and so he needs Tick for the ceremony. Yet, um, the problem is, consent, and you can't kidnap somebody's father and force him to do something, that they don't want to do, and that's essentially what Samuels wants to do. So yeah, he explains that he's not a follower of the bylaws and he won't release Tick's father until he completes a special ceremony. And then he leaves. He's like, I'm gonna do what I want to do. Okay, so y'all can fuck off. So the next scene features Tick, George, and Letty returning to the silo where they encountered the sheriff earlier that day. They all had the suspicion that Tick's father was being held in that silo because the sheriff was just acting real sketchy, and like she was just guarding it. So they go inside and they start looking around. The sheriff, of course, drops down on him. She was like, "Oh, you N words! I knew y'all were gonna try to cause some mischiefs." Letty comes out of nowhere and knocks her the f out. Just she got a rifle from somewhere and just butt her in the head. So the sheriff is out. They start looking for Tick's dad, and they find him um actually in like a tomb because his favorite book is The Cask of Amontillado, and obviously in that one the dude is buried to death. So they found him, yeah, in the ground. I am completely blanking on the character's name, but he's a really interesting actor. And, but the character's name in the show is Montrose. And when they find them, they're like, "We got to get out of here." So they steal a car and try to make a quick escape, but they actually crash because that invisible force field that was blocking Tick's door earlier, they've got on the exits to the driveway. So all four of them just smash into this force field. Car totaled. They try to crawl out. As they're crawling out, Samuel and Christina roll up on them like children of the corn, and they're like, "Oh, y'all done fucked up. We kept trying to be nice to y'all," and it's funny. They're like basically keeping these people captive, and the whole time they're like, "We're treating you guys so well. You guys should be so grateful." Yeah, they get there, and as soon as Letty gets out the car, Samuel just shoots her right in the gut. She's bleeding out. Tick starts freaking out. He's like, "Well, if you don't cooperate, everybody's gonna die." And then boom, he shoots George. We're like, oh my God, what just happened? The next scene, we got George being held, putting on robes and shit, but he has this magical mirror which he can see. You know, a lot of them have the use of magical mirrors where they can see, like one-sided magical mirrors where they can see what's going on with other people. So he's looking in this one-sided magical mirror. He sees George, his father, and Letty. Letty wakes up. Somehow they magically revive her and she's alive, but we can see that George is still injured on the bed. And they basically promise him, if you go through the ceremony, we'll heal George. So, ceremony begins. The ceremony is the climax of this show. And the ceremony is it's, you know, it's kind of traditional, almost cliche in its delivery, but they put it to the voiceover of a poem called Whitey's on the Moon, which I'm gonna have to look up the details of it and put it on the website, but it's essentially a poem that just it's just a juxtaposition of white people's experience and black people's experience at the same time in the same country, and it shows how these two realities are so different. You know, it's basically talking about how black people are struggling to survive, but you know, white people are on the moon, and how black people are being murdered by cops, but white people are on the moon. You know, and it just shows that this country, while it can do such amazing things, a lot of times we do these amazing things at the expense of so many people, and while ignoring all the things we could be doing to improve the condition of the people in this nation. So this awesome poem's going on in the background, and the ceremony begins. Samuel is doing, you know, the chant, the whole, you know, the charm, the witches, the bubble, toil and trouble, Hamlet, you know, chant, and all the magic starts glowing in the room. The hieroglyphics in the room start glowing. Everything starts getting charged up, and Tick eventually starts getting enveloped in the magic. The magic just starts enveloping him. It starts obviously causing pain. I think what's hinted to earlier is that this ceremony killed Titus. I mean, it blew up the lodge the first time, and so whatever's happening is we're getting the feeling that it's going to kill Tick. Um, but before it can really rip through him, we see this window open up, this portal open up in front of him, and we see this black woman, this pregnant black woman, and it has to be Hannah, who was the ancestor that escaped. There's just a strong connection that he feels. Something with her connects, and it takes over. It makes him able to somehow break free of this spell. And so there's a big explosion, big, huge explosion. Samuel and all the other cult members in the room just get turned to stone. They turn into statues. And before, you know, we can even like breathe a sigh of relief because Tick has survived this crazy ceremony, the whole estate begins to collapse. First, we see George, Montrose, and Letty try, you know, they're forced to escape. So Letty and Montrose like try to drag, you know, George out. He's still, you know, bleeding pretty heavily, so they try to pull him out. And then at the same time, we see the apparition that Tick was seeing, his ancestor, basically kind of ghost run him out the facility. It really was a powerful scene because the experience of escaping for slaves was a very real thing, and a lot of slaves had to just endure so many obstacles, you know, and pregnant slaves did have to escape for their freedom. I mean, what more reason could you think? What stronger motivator could you think to try to escape other than, you know, to possibly bring your child into a life of freedom? So it just was very powerful that the connections that were being made, and the fact that this woman Hannah was being captive by this man, and in many ways her ancestors are kind of forced into this exact same cycle. Even though they're free, they still have to deal with kind of this oppression and this captivity. And in a way, a captivity that's meant to extract and exploit their bodies. In a lot of ways, I saw a lot of parallels to Get Out. I don't know if anybody's seen that or if everybody's seen it by now, but the idea that that black bodies are for white consumption, and not only just for white consumption, but are for um, white people to actually inhabit and destroy. So yeah, this episode just really touched on some like really, really, I think, tender topics, but in a really awesome way. So yeah, Tick escapes from the estate. The whole group escapes from the estate. Unfortunately, George doesn't make it, and the episode ends with them all mourning George. He bled out in the car. Once again, this show just it almost every episode feels like a standalone project. Like every episode has such a great introduction, and it's the tension builds, the climax is really great, and then the end, you have that release of emotion, and it's almost like each episode is just like a standalone piece, but we know this is part of a larger story that's being told. It's firmly set up, I think, in the supernatural horror genre. You couldn't tell from the first episode really what kind of. I was like, maybe this is just gonna be like a historical time, or maybe this is magical realism. But no, this is definitely supernatural horror. It'll definitely put you in the mindset of like the Twilight Zone or Get Out. So once again, check it out. It's really a interesting experiment. It feels very experimental in the direction and the approach that they take with it. The cinematography is great. I really like the wardrobe choices as well. I really like everything they're doing so far. This was directed by Daniel Sakim or Sackheim. Once again, this is executive produced by Jordan Peele and J.J. Abrams. This actually comes on, they debut every episode on Sundays. So if you're wondering where to watch it, it's on HBO Max on Sundays. Thank you guys so much for listening to this long, once again, stream of consciousness. This was the Breeze Lovecraft Country episode 2 synopsis, and stay tuned in a couple days for a really, really, really awesome podcast on Polly Murray, who was just this radical, incredibly intelligent, transgendered, lesbian, Episcopalian priest. Putting up with bigotry, do we know the cost? We claim to have it figured out, but moral ground is lost. Jacob Blake say his name, another life cut short. No one cares to listen, not the media or course. A day will come when liberty and freedom has been reached. That day is not today. The stain of racism needs more bleach.